Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen. All right. I'd like to welcome you all. Closer? Yeah. Closer. Can you hear me? Okay. I'd like to welcome you all to the Vito Marcantonio Forum's 4th commemoration of Congressman Vito Marcantonio, the congressman who served East Harlem from 1935 to 1950. And we are here at this spot today. You will learn, and when you will learn why we're commemorating him this year at this spot, if you're like me, it'll choke you up. But we are an organization that commemorates the memory and educates the public about Congressman Marcantonio and his advocacy for civil rights and for racial harmony and for equality of opportunity for all Americans and even people abroad. And you will learn, if you don't really know much about him, you will learn plenty in a fast, basically a binge learning through the People's Proclamation, which we will read at some point today. Now we start our ceremony by having a poem called the Litany of San Vito, read by Gil Fagiani. And Gil is a translator, essayist, short storyteller, and poet. His latest book is Logos, which is published by Guernica. Gil co-hosts the Italian American Writers Association monthly readings in Manhattan. In 2004, he was the subject of a New York Times article by David Gonzalez, A Poet Memories of Drug Addiction. Now, accompanying Gil, just raise your hand for a moment. Where are you? There's Gil Fagiani. Okay, so he will be accompanied. He will read his poem in English, but he will be accompanied by Simone Cinotto, who is also a member of the Vito Marcantonio Forum, and he's an associate professor of history at the Università of Forenzo in Italy, and he's a visiting scholar at the Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies at New York University, and wrote a book on the Italian-American table, food, family, and community, which is about like the founding of Italian food as a cultural phenomenon in the United States. And then also being read, the same poem, Litany, read in Spanish by Gloria Quinones, who is a lawyer and a lifelong resident of El Barrio. Where's Gloria? There she is. Who is active in community and political activities to bring about a more equitable public policy for all people. Okay, we have never done this poem with all 3 languages combined. We usually only do 2 of the 3. So hopefully we're going to do this more gracefully than that Lucille Ball episode with the language chain, right? So, so ladies and gentlemen, Gil Fagiani, Simone Cinotto, and Gloria Quinones. Okay.
So I'm going to start by reading it in English, and I'll read it, we'll each read the same line, but in a different language. Litany of San Vito to Congressman Vito Marcantonio, 1901 to 1954. San Vito of East Harlem, pray for us.
San Vito di East Harlem, prega per noi.
San Vito del Barrio, ruega por nosotros.
San Vito, bread of the poor, pray for us.
San Vito, pane dei poveri, prega per noi.
San Vito, pan de los pobres, ruega por nosotros.
San Vito, crucified by Wall Street, pray for us.
San Vito, crocifisso da Wall Street, prega per noi.
San Vito, crucificado por Wall Street, ruega por nosotros.
San Vito, martyr of McCarthyism, pray for us.
San Vito, martire del maccartismo, prega per noi.
San Vito, mártir del marcartismo, ruega por nosotros.
From the jail cell walls, San Vito, deliver us.
Dalle pareti della prigione, San Vito, liberaci.
De las paredes de la cárcel, San Vito, líbranos.
From the backyard crap game, San Vito, deliver us.
Dal gioco d'azzardo dei cortili, San Vito, liberaci.
Del juego de dados en el patio, San Vito, líbranos.
From the loan shark's vig, San Vito, deliver us.
Dal pizzo dello strozzino San Vito liberaci.
Del prestamista sin escrúpulos, San Vito, líbranos.
From the drunken stupor, San Vito, protect us.
Dall'ubriachezza molesta San Vito liberaci.
De la embriaguez del alcohol, San Vito, líbranos.
From TB and asthma, San Vito, protect us.
Dalla tubercolosi e dall'asma San Vito proteggici.
De la tuberculosis y el asma, San Vito, protégenos.
From the social worker's visit, San Vito, protect us.
Dalla visita dell'assistente sociale San Vito proteggici.
De la visita del trabajador social, San Vito, protégenos.
From immigration raids, San Vito, protect us.
Dalla caccia agli immigrati San Vito proteggici.
De las redadas de inmigración, San Vito, protégenos.
From the landlord's greed, San Vito, protect us.
Dall'avarizia del padrone di casa San Vito proteggici.
De la avaricia del casero, San Vito, protégenos.
Bravo, bravi, 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 bravissimi.
Let me lean this here. That might be the solution to that. Okay. So, again, if you didn't know who Vito Marcantonio was, all right, that poem, that prayer, that litany, thank you, Gil, thank you, Simone, thank you, Gloria, would give you a hint, all right? Obviously, a defender of the underdog, okay, and certainly the kind of leadership that resonates with a lot of people today as people search for a generation of leaders in today's contemporary politics. The other thing that I want you to note is that the poem was recited in English, Italian, and Spanish, partly because Vito Marcantonio inherited Fiorello LaGuardia's congressional district, which had a population, had become the biggest Little Italy in the United States, but also had a growing Puerto Rican population that became El Barrio. And so Marcantonio worked towards getting the different ethnic groups to work together, which includes the Italians, the Puerto Ricans, the African Americans, the Caribbean community, and other ethnic groups. There's a long-standing Jewish community in East Harlem, and other groups that populated East Harlem, including when he gerrymandered the district, and he had to, and he began working with more Irish and German Americans. So, with that said, I would like to, let's see, this is the part of the program where we have some guest speakers, and while we wait for the public officials to arrive, we will have Speaker Melissa Mark-Viverito and Manhattan Borough President Gale Brewer. The third speaker in this portion of the program is, you've already seen her, Gloria Quinones, who, like I said, is an attorney and lifelong resident of East Harlem and an advocate for the community.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm here to speak on what would Vito Marcantonio's relationship to Puerto Rico be today. If Vito Marcantonio were with us today, the people of Puerto Rico would have a true friend and ally in Congress. We'd hear Vito loudly denouncing today the shameful colonial relationship that exists between the United States and Puerto Rico since 1898 to the present. He did this while he served in Congress. And among the issues that he'd be taking up today is that the current form of government establishing that relationship in 1950, approved by Congress in 1950. Under that relationship, the people of Puerto Rico, although citizens of the United States who were made eligible to serve in the war, would not vote for president, would not elect members to Congress nor senators. And all federal laws, excuse the pun, would be trumped. All local laws would trump local law. Vito was well aware of this shameful act of Congress and would have spoken out against it today. In fact, Vito would have supported the findings, the repeated findings of the United Nations Committee on Decolonization that Puerto Rico's form of government does not create a sovereign state, that it continues the relationship that existed when they took over, when Spain ceded Puerto Rico under the Treaty of Paris in 1890. And he would call on Congress, his members, his fellow members in Congress, to initiate the decolonization process as provided in the United Nations Charter, a process that would honor the right to sovereignty of the people of Puerto Rico and abolish the status of the United States' only remaining colony. Today, Puerto Rico is in the midst of a devastating $70 billion debt crisis. We could have counted on Vito's vote and vigorous opposition to the enactment of Promesa, a brutal federal law written by Wall Street bankers imposing an oversight board over the government of Puerto Rico. The board, whose costs must be paid by the people of Puerto Rico, will have the power to ensure investors are paid first at the expense of vital services to the people of Puerto Rico, including reducing the minimum wage of young people 25 and under to $4.25. It includes the privatization of the water supply and the electric utility, sale of government lands. This, a board who was not elected by the people of Puerto Rico, but imposed by the Congress just recently. To pay, this board will ensure that the debt incurred by corrupt government, local government officials and bondholders will be paid by the people of Puerto Rico. Vito would be speaking against the cabotage laws that were enacted in 1920. It's a federal law that seeks to promote and maintain the American merchant marine, requiring that all goods transported by water between U.S. ports be carried on U.S. flagged ships constructed in the United States, owned by U.S. citizens and crewed by U.S. citizens. The Jones Act prevents foreign flagged ships from carrying cargo between the U.S. mainland and non-contiguous parts of the United States such as Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Alaska, and Guam. Foreign ships with goods coming into Puerto Rico cannot stop in Puerto Rico and offload goods. They have to come to Florida, remove the cargo onto U.S. ships, and then they are allowed to deliver their goods to Puerto Rico. This imposes an extra cost on the goods consumed by the people of Puerto Rico, who are already among the poorest in the U.S. citizens. Because foreign ships cannot leave their cargo in Puerto Rico's ports, but must go to Florida and unload, then load the same goods onto the U.S. ships. Vito would have been an advocate of the campaign to free Oscar Lopez Rivera, the longest held political prisoner in history of Puerto Rico, which he's been jailed along with others to discourage the independence movement of Puerto Rico, to teach the people of Puerto Rico a lesson that they must not advocate for Puerto Rico's independence. Oscar Lopez has been jailed for 35 years and is presently detained in the federal prison at Terre Haute, Indiana. As a member of the U.S. Armed Forces, Lopez Rivera received the Congressional Medal of Honor for his military service in Vietnam, and he was sentenced to 55 years in 1981 for seditious conspiracy to commit crimes dealing with the independence of Puerto Rico, that the violence was never proven. His sentence was increased to another 15 years for an attempted escape. Obama has refused to heed the calls of the people of Puerto Rico and international leaders and the United States to free Oscar Rivera. Vito, we are certain, would have been one of the advocates to free Oscar Lopez Rivera. The cleanup of Vieques, the island of Vieques, where the U.S. Navy bombed a beautiful island for 60 years and rented it out to other countries so that there would be bombing on that island. An island which is contaminated, and the United States has a duty to clean up and has not assigned the funds for that. We know that we would have been able to count on Vito to take this issue up and ensure that this cleanup occurred. And so what do we say? What can we conclude? We dearly need another Vito in Congress, and we miss that spirit. Thank you.
The Vito thank you very much, Gloria. The Vito Marcantonio Forum likes to underscore how Vito Marcantonio remains relevant today as a case study, as a frame of reference for leadership and advocacy and the importance of, again, providing equality of opportunity for the underdog and people who live their everyday lives. And nowhere, Puerto Rico is such a clear example of his continued relevance. In 1950, in his last speeches before the political parties ganged up on him to defeat him, he said made a lot of relevant, transcendent remarks about many topics, and Puerto Rico was one of them. And I'd like to now introduce you to the Speaker of the City Council, who also had a history of advocating for Vieques. The Honorable Melissa Mark-Viverito, she came to our event in 2014 at Woodlawn Cemetery. She's come to our event honoring Marcantonio last year as well, when we had a walking tour of East Harlem, and doesn't just, show up fleetingly and disappears. She's very much concerned with the substance of Vito Marcantonio and the substance of what our organization does. So, Honorable Mark-Viverito, to take your distinguished career and reduce it to 5 sentences. She currently serves as a speaker. She was the first Puerto Rican and Latina to hold citywide elected office. She represents the 8th District, which includes El Barrio, East Harlem, and the South Bronx. And the East Harlem portion contains a lot of Congressman Marcantonio's old congressional district. She was the founding co-chair of the Progressive Caucus and is a member of the Black, Latino, and Asian Caucus. In 2011, when she was one of the 4 council members to pioneer the first ever participatory budgeting process in New York City, so that more people have a say in the budgeting process of New York City, so it's not such an arcane process that excludes people. She was, after she was elected in her first term in 2005 as councilwoman, she sponsored and passed several pieces of legislation regarding tenant harassment, building safety, green buildings, and park conservancy. And Mayor de Blasio and Speaker Viverito expanded the Earned Sick Time Tax Act, known as the Paid Sick Leave, to include 500,000 more New Yorkers. She has a natural and instinctive and intellectual understanding of effective constituency services for her own district, and then appreciates it for Vito Marcantonio as a frame of reference of those, providing those kinds of constituency services. Enough said. Mark-Viverito. Speaker Mark-Viverito.
Good afternoon to everybody. First of all, to Robert, to LuLu LoLo, to all of those, Dr. Meyer, with regards to the setting up and establishing this forum. I really want to thank you, because it is a way of preserving legacy and history. And I think that that's something that we always need to reflect on as we move forward and be guided, right, by the paths and the trajectory and the work of those that came before us. So I'm really proud to be here once again. I think I was at Woodlawn Cemetery about 2 years ago, in El Barrio last year, now here. Obviously every site of relevance to Vito's life. And so I really want to thank the forum for the work that it does. And I know Gloria spoke very eloquently about the commonalities that we have. Let me just say something. One of the things when I came into office, it's now 11 years, but Gloria is one of my mentors, and many of you know her. And one of the things that she was very clear about was that as I moved forward in the work that I had to do to represent El Barrio East Harlem and the South Bronx, that I not forget the legacy that came before me, right? And to be guided by the progressive legacy of a Vito Marcantonio, of an Evelina Antonetti, of a congressman, Adam Clayton Powell. That is the thing. Those are the histories and the work that we have to reflect on. So when we think about relating Vito's legacy as one of the original progressives, right, to the work that we are engaging in right now, we really need a voice like that now more than ever, right? Someone who would not be afraid to speak up very strongly and vociferously against the anti-immigrant sentiment that we're seeing in this nation in this presidential discourse. He was very much someone that was a progressive that could really fight across communities. He was an ally to us as Boricuas, as Puerto Ricans. He was an ally to the immigrant communities. And that is something that I really believe in, and I believe is the way that I look at the work that I do, is that if I want equality and justice for myself as a woman, as a Latina, then I need to fight as hard as hell for equality and justice for my LGBT brothers and sisters, my immigrant communities, right, my African American communities and brothers and sisters. We got to find the commonalities in those struggles, and Vito did that very, very well and very strongly. So it really is, it's a moment to reflect on that work, and very much thank the forum for everything that it does each and every day. We're living in very difficult times right now. I think that the political discourse is one that has really taken us back, unfortunately, quite a few decades in terms of the work that we've done. So we have to really stand strong and be vocal and be diligent and vigilant in what is happening around us. And for me, as a very strong and very proud Puerto Rican woman, the issue of the future of Puerto Rico is very important to me. As Gloria was laying out, one of the priorities for me personally, clearly the fiscal crisis and the impending fiscal control board is of serious concern. But for me right now, between now and the end of President Obama's term, is to ensure that we get the freedom for Oscar Lopez Rivera. And we know for sure that Vito Marcantonio would have been a friend and an ally in that struggle. We need Oscar, who is now 35 years imprisoned, longer than what Mandela served in jail, to be released. And so that is something that we really need to build alliances and solidarity beyond our immediate community. I really hope people here would help us in that cause, as I know our congressman would have. So again, thank you so much for the work that you do to preserve that memory and that legacy. I'm proud to be here with you today, and I'm very humbled to be able to serve in that city hall on your behalf. So thank you very much, and look forward to the work ahead.
Thank you, Speaker Viverito. And I also, I remember when you were first elected, and someone told me that in your inaugural speech as a councilwoman, you mentioned Vito Marcantonio, and I just knew.
You have a banner with him.
There you go, all right. I knew things were on the right track,
yes.
Exactly. I would like to mention also that Twitter this year is 10 years old, and there were, believe it or not, Vito Marcantonio came up in this presidential campaign. I won't bring up how, but that, and I've been on Google Alert since like 2010. I would make a classic New York City pinky bet with anybody that Vito Marcantonio has been tweeted about more this year than in the previous 9 years of Twitter combined. So if you build it, they will come, and that's what we're doing with Vito Marcantonio. So I don't think that the borough president is here yet. So what I would like to do is go to the next part of the program, and then, which is a reading of the people's, what we call it is we gave it two names, the People's Proclamation for the People's Politician and the People's Proclamation for Vito Marcantonio, right? Now I'd like to say a few words about this proclamation, and I'm glad that the speaker's still here while I talk about this. 2 years ago, for the commemoration in Woodlawn Cemetery, we actually put together a draft of a proclamation, and we gave it to several public officials and asked if they could make this into an official proclamation that can be framed and for the record. And I will say that this was received very favorably. So, for instance, Speaker Viverito, who presented the proclamation, was on board, and I think Councilmember Cohen signed on board because he was the council member that includes Woodlawn Cemetery. Then we also had Manhattan Borough Brewer, President Gale Brewer, who came up with the proclamation, Assemblymember Robert Rodriguez, who came to the event, Borough President Ruben Diaz, Congressman Charles Rangel, and Congressman Elliot Engel actually drafted something that was put in the official congressional record honoring Vito Marcantonio, which I think is an accomplishment. And though State Senator Jose Serrano was not able to make it, he also put a proclamation together. And what's interesting is that many of our whereas clauses were really controversial and pushed the envelope. And I was very pleased to know that, you know, the speaker and others were not afraid to include many of those whereas clauses in the proclamation, because I guess the times are changing, and you know, people appreciate what he tried to do. So having said all that, and acknowledging all these public officials for the proclamation, and not yet seeing Manhattan Borough President Gale Brewer, I would like to begin the People's Proclamation for Vito Marcantonio, beginning with LuLu LoLo Pascale.
A People's Proclamation for the People's Politician, Vito Marcantonio, issued by the Vito Marcantonio Forum on August 28, 2016, at the site of Vito Marcantonio's death, Broadway, outside of City Hall Park, across from the Woolworth Building. A People's Proclamation for the People's Politician to proudly honor the contributions of Representative Vito Marcantonio and their benefit to New York City, the nation, and the world, along with the efforts of the Vito Marcantonio Forum to honor the Congressman's memory at the 4th annual commemoration of Vito Marcantonio and beyond. Whereas Vito Marcantonio was born on December 10, 1902, to an Italian immigrant mother and an American-born father, both from the city of Potenza in the Basilicata region of southern Italy, and grew up in East Harlem when it contained the largest Little Italy in the United States and attracted Puerto Ricans to an area that emerged as El Barrio. And whereas Vito Marcantonio helped his intellectual mentor, Leonard Cavello, an innovative educator who instructed Marcantonio at DeWitt Clinton High School in New York City's first Italian class taught in a public school, and began the interscholastic Circolo Italiano at New York University in 1921. And whereas developing a lifelong personal friendship and professional relationship, Marcantonio and Cavello would become the first Italian-American high school principal in New York City, invited Frank Sinatra to sing to students at Benjamin Franklin High School in 1945 to foster racial harmony after an incident between Italian-American and African-American youngsters, and encouraged these youngsters, along with Puerto Rican students, to march arm in arm in the Columbus Day Parade. Yeah.
Simone Cinotto. And whereas, after graduating from New York University Law School, Marcantonio began working together with Fiorello LaGuardia. When LaGuardia was elected congressman from East Harlem in 1924, he named Marcantonio his aide-de-camp, campaign manager, and protege from 1924 to 1933, when he became mayor. In 1934, Marcantonio, after he helped LaGuardia become mayor, he won LaGuardia congressional seat. And whereas Marcantonio built a powerful political organization, enabling him to directly serve 300 to 400 constituents each weekend and responded to the immediate needs of his Italian, Puerto Rican, African American, West Indian, Jewish, German, Hungarian, and Irish constituents. And whereas, partly because of its long-standing neighborhood presence, accessibility, and responsiveness to the everyday needs, Marcantonio created an unbreakable bond with his diverse political constituency that enabled him to build a coalition among them.
Thank you.
Bravo, bravo.
Okay. And whereas the congressman initially opposed World War II as an imperialist war, but then assessed the growing threat of the Nazis, particularly after the invasion of the Soviet Union, and publicly supported America's entry into the war over a month before Congress's official declaration of war following the attack on Pearl Harbor. And whereas Marcantonio defended Italian Americans against mistreatment during World War II, when the Italian language was characterized as the enemy's language, and Italian Americans were perceived as enemies of the state. Some were sent to internment camps, and others were required to register as enemy aliens. Characterized as enemy aliens, those characterized as enemy aliens were required to surrender shortwave radios, binoculars, and other contraband, as well as carry a permit to travel beyond a 5-mile radius of their homes. They were subjected to FBI raids and nightly house arrest. Italian Americans were viewed suspiciously, and even though they would enlist for World War II in higher proportions than any other demographic group. And whereas Marcantonio's advocacy for Italian Americans was especially welcomed at a time when even the greatest baseball player of that era, Joe DiMaggio, witnessed his father's persecution for the crime of being Italian. DiMaggio's father saw his livelihood idled when his fishing boat was confiscated and was not even permitted to go to his son's restaurant on Fisherman's Wharf. Less than a year after DiMaggio hit safely in 56 consecutive games and won the Most Valuable Player award.
It's all. And whereas during World War II, Marcantonio argued that Caucasians and African Americans were biologically identical, and so the anti-Nazi effort and the survival of soldiers required the desegregation of blood banks. Marcantonio also advocated for African Americans in labor organizing efforts, and from 1942 to 1950 became the major advocate for civil rights in the House of Representatives. Thanks a lot. As taught to him by Pharaoh LaGuardia, Marcantonio used parliamentary procedure skillfully to become the first representative to bring passage from the House the anti-poll tax and anti-lynching bills only to see them filibuster in the United States Senate. And whereas, as a national leader of the left, Marcantonio fought to desegregate Washington, D.C. and introduced a House resolution in 1945 directing the Secretary of Commerce to investigate the employment practices of Major League Baseball clubs to determine if they discriminate against African Americans. This resolution helped to break the color barrier that paved the way for Jackie Robinson's hiring by the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. And whereas after the FBI arrested 80-year-old W.E. Du Bois in handcuffs, alleging he was a foreign agent in response to his circulating a petition against the atomic bomb after the Geneva Peace Convention. And as Dr. Albert Einstein was raising funds for Dr. Du Bois' defense, Vito Marcantonio took on the case pro bono and won an acquittal, calling Dr. Du Bois the greatest living American. And after also winning an acquittal for pro bono African-American leader William Patterson, the three men, Du Bois, Patterson, and Marcantonio, subsequently presented petitions to the United States General Assembly to protest the treatment of African Americans in the United States.
It's okay. And whereas, as well as being an advocate for El Barrio, Marcantonio served throughout his congressional career as the de facto representative of Puerto Rico, defending Pedro Albizu Campos when jailed for his leadership of the island's independence movement, and pressing for the cultural, economic, and territorial integrity of the island. This advocacy, including backing the right for Puerto Rico to retain Spanish as the language of instruction, to develop a diverse economy beyond the sugar plantations, and to declare itself an independent nation. And whereas Marcantonio introduced 5 bills in the United States House of Representatives, calling for independence for Puerto Rico with indemnification for the destruction of the island's economy by the American sugar barons, and using his influence in the House to ensure that Puerto Rico was included in the Wage and Hours Bill and that it received its fair share of congressional appropriations.
Thank you, Rita. Luis Romero.
This is number 6. And whereas Vito Marcantonio served East Harlem in the House of Representatives from 1935 to 1937, and from 1939 to 1950, his 14-year term represents the longest tenure served by a radical figure in Congress. And whereas Marcantonio ran as a Republican in 1934 and 1936, in 1938 he enrolled in the American Labor Party, the ALP, and ran on the American Labor Party line for mayor in 1949. He continued to contest the major parties' primaries, winning the Republican Party primary in 1938 and in 1940, and the Democratic Party primary in 1946. In 1942 and 1944, he spectacularly won both major party primaries, thereby running unopposed in the general elections. After passage of the Wilson-Pakula Act in 1947, Marcantonio was barred by the reactionary forces allied against him from running in the Democratic and Republican parties' primaries.
Nicholas Artur.
Whereas Congressman Marcantonio led the drive to defeat the anti-union Taft-Hartley Act and successfully fought for the creation of the Fair Employment Practice Commission, advocating for legislation and policies seeking equality of opportunity and a better standard of living for American workers and farmers of every religion, nationality, and race. And whereas courageously Marcantonio on the floor of the House of Representatives and in court defended the Communist Party's First Amendment rights, adopted some of their labor agenda, and opposed the Marshall Plan, which he viewed as benefiting Wall Street, and cast the only vote in both houses of Congress against the Korean War.
Lionel Francois.
And whereas on August 9th, 1954, after he fell dead of a massive heart attack on Broadway across from the Woolworth Building at the age of 51, tens of thousands of New Yorkers of all backgrounds attended his funeral to mourn their loss. Paul Robeson released to the press a eulogy entitled "Negro Americans Have Lost a Tried and True Friend," describing Marcantonio as the Thaddeus Stevens of the first half of the 20th century, and as Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, along with Dr. Leonard Covello, served as honorary pallbearers. And whereas, acting as the antithesis of political elitism, Marcantonio received thousands of letters of gratitude during his lifetime that characterized him as tribune of the people and the people's politician. Many Catholics and non-Catholics alike who had received his help or were inspired by him named their children after him. And whereas, since the late 1990s, there is increasing evidence of public recognition of Marcantonio's contributions, including the founding in October 2011 of the Vito Marcantonio Forum, a cultural cultural and educational organization that brings together people from a wide variety of backgrounds dedicated to disseminating and sharing knowledge of the life and work of Vito Marcantonio, along with well-attended academic and dramatized presentations, walking tours, video segments, web postings, and the republishing of I Vote My Conscience, the speeches, writings, and debates of Vito Marcantonio.
All right, Quinones.
And whereas Marcantonio is a masterful role model and frame of reference for leadership and coalition building, useful for confronting the issues we face today, such as racial inequality, immigrant rights, labor rights, and equality of opportunity for economic independence and sustainability for the poor and middle class. And whereas despite his self-identification as a Catholic, Cardinal Patrick Spellman refused to allow Marcantonio a Catholic burial and is buried in Woodlawn Cemetery, a non-denominational resting place in the Bronx, next to his wife and community advocate Miriam Sanders, and nearby his mentor Fiorello LaGuardia. His resting place is marked with a tombstone inscribed with the words, Vito Marcantonio, Defender of Human Rights.
And last but not least, Adam Meyer.
Thank you, Roberto. Therefore, be it known that the Vito Marcantonio Forum is convinced that the life and work of Vito Marcantonio has been unfairly ignored and presents to people today guidelines for a progressive politics that promises significant gains for a more genuinely democratic United States. And therefore, be it further known that those assembled and future signatories of any paper or online petition of the People's Proclamation for the People's Politician with pride honor the contributions of Representative Vito Marcantonio and their benefit to New York City, the nation, and the world, along with the efforts of the Vito Marcantonio Forum to honor the Congressman's memory at the site of his death, right here on Broadway outside City Hall across from the Woolworth Building today, August 28th, 2016 and beyond. I make a motion that we all approve this People's Proclamation for the People's Politician. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say nay. All right, the ayes win it. Thank you everyone for coming down.
All right, thanks very much, Adam. And again, this is, like I said, this is like the crash course on Vito Marcantonio, listening to this People's Proclamation. And it is very haunting to actually have the event, if we're not having it at Woodlawn Cemetery, to have it here and to hear somebody recite that he died outside City Hall Park across from the Woolworth Building. So I hope you're as moved as I was by that. And I thank you all for coming here today. All right, we have here today our other prominent public official. We have the Honorable Gale Brewer. Okay, again, you're someone else who has to, I have to take a very distinguished career and reduce it down to 5 sentences. Okay, but I'll do this really quick. What I will say about Gale is that when I worked at the City Council and Gale was a council member, I would hear the way she would run her constituency office, and every letter had to be responded to, and every constituent had to get a response. And one day I walked up to her, I said, have you ever heard of Vito Marcantonio? Of course I have. He's a great man. So I was very pleased to know that you know who he was. So the Honorable Gale Brewer was in the council for 12 years, from 2002 to 2013, represented the Upper West Side and Clinton. As a council member, she played a pioneering role on the initial Sick Leave Act, leaving sick leave for most hourly employees, compelling landlords to fix repeat violations, requiring all city data to be published online, and the nation's first law protecting domestic workers. She was the founding chair of the Council's Technology Committee in 2002 and advocated for the reduction of what was called the digital divide, which is to give low-income households the opportunity to have access to the internet. Elected as the borough president in 2013 with tremendous name recognition for her years of service, the Honorable Gale Brewer has been involved on issues as wide-ranging as traffic congestion, confronting the high commercial rents that even keep proven entrepreneurs from staying afloat, and issues, food-related issues such as food issues from the standpoint of summer meals for kids, fresh food for seniors, local sourcing and urban agriculture, and finally even the composting of food waste. So, ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Gale Brewer.
Thank you very much, Roberto. It is a big honor to be here because public service needs the kind of efforts that this wonderful, amazing gentleman provided, and none of us can keep up with his reputation and what he accomplished. But I just want to say a few things about him. I want to thank Roberto. I'm going to thank LuLu in a minute. And I want to just say, I remember in October of 2014, we talked also about the importance of this amazingly phenomenal man. The fact that he was in East Harlem when it was the largest Little Italy in the United States, and that I actually thought that he was so dynamic, he had to be a council member, but he was just a member of Congress, which is also phenomenal. He is inspiring even to this day. It's really hard to think of anyone today, anyone, who has achieved anything close to his list of righteous causes. Defender of human rights, protecting Italian Americans against mistreatment during World War II, all of which you know, making sure that he was representative of the Puerto Rican community, the de facto representative of Puerto Rico in the House, speaking 3 languages, Italian, Spanish, and English. We could all learn from that. A major congressional advocate for the civil rights of African Americans, fighting to desegregate Washington, D.C. These issues continue. A 1945 resolution directing an investigation of Major League Baseball clubs that helped to break the color barrier and paved the way for Jackie Robinson's hiring by the Dodgers. We all know about this. Leader of the drive to defeat the anti-union Taft-Hartley Act, fighter for the Fair Employment Practice Commission. We're still doing these things. Advocating for legislation and policies seeking equal opportunity and a better standard of living for American workers and farmers sounds very familiar to everything that we're trying to do today. But if you really want to know something about this amazing man, Vito Marcantonio, all you have to do is to get to know and love the people who respect him, the people who are here, the people who keep his lifetime achievements alive year after year. We all know Roberto. He has been my friend since he worked in the City Council. Assembly Member Brian Kavanaugh loves him also, and I love Brian Kavanaugh, so Roberto has to be fabulous. But I want to add my friend LuLu and her family, who've been members of the East Harlem community for generations, but not everybody knew her mother. And so for me to know Rose, we don't forget her. Maggie Payton and I do not forget her. Guess where she worked? The office of the Manhattan Borough President. For decades, she was the backbone of that office. So you talk about her in terms of this wonderful man, but she was also an amazing public servant herself, and that's the role that LuLu carries to this day. Obviously, LuLu is also part of this amazing forum. This congressman represents the very best of our diverse and tolerant city and inspires us today, unlike anyone else, with his unfettered faith and opportunity for everyone who works hard and plays fair. So as we recognize the 62nd anniversary of his death, we celebrate how far we have come thanks to great New Yorkers like him. And to bring us to 2016, as we rezone East Harlem, we have to find ways to honor his contributions and memorialize them so that others see the need to continue his amazing efforts. I want to thank everyone who's here because this was an amazing man. Very hard to live up to any of his contributions, but we can all try, and we do that by continuing his legacy. Congratulations, everyone, but particularly LuLu and Roberto, whom I know and love. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Honorable Gale Brewer. I always want to just call you Gale, all right? It's okay, right, okay. Gale, thank you. Yeah, you know something, again, we had two public officials today, Gale and Melissa Mark-Viverito, who were introspective about Vito Marcantonio. I mean, that in itself is an accomplishment, that a public official could know who he is and be introspective about what he did, how relevant that he is today, and how one can emulate him, whether they are in public service or in whatever other role one plays in one's life. So I thank you for those transcendent words about Vito Marcantonio. So the next part of the program is I just want to do one quick time check, because the Parks Department, if we're not out of here by 4:15, the Parks Department is going to turn me into a pumpkin and set up a pumpkin patch, and I'll be the pioneer of pumpkin in the park, right? And this will be enforced by the police department. So we now have Dr. Gerald Meyer, who will give a eulogy, what we've entitled a eulogy for a fallen hero. Gerald Meyer is a founding member of the faculty of the Hostos Community College. He authored perhaps the definitive book about Vito Marcantonio, called Vito Marcantonio, Radical Politician, 1902 to 1954, because it talks about why he would continue to be reelected despite the radicalism, his radical point of view, right? Why people would walk with the newspaper under their arms saying, vote against Vito Marcantonio, he's a communist, and continue to vote for him. He co-edited The Lost World. Dr. Meyer also co-edited The Lost World of Italian-American Radicalism, has been published for over 80 articles and reviews on a wide variety of subjects. He serves on the editorial boards of Socialism and Democracy and Science and Society. He appears in documentaries and manuscripts for publication and lectures widely. He is the co-chair of the Vito Marcantonio Forum. And when Vito Marcantonio kept reoccurring in my life over the years since the mid-1980s, and somebody said, let me mail you this book, it was the book written by Gerald Meyer, and that began our collaboration since 1996. Dr. Gerald Meyer.
Nice to see Gale, thank you very much. And Melissa, oh my God, we're so lucky that we have elected officials like you. And thank you so much, Gloria. Quinones is an old friend, a colleague of mine from Hostos Community College, and like LuLu LoLo, a lifelong resident of East Harlem, basically living on the same block where Vito Marcantonio lived and where his political headquarters was. So we have a very direct lineage to that really remarkable tradition and remarkable history. And as the Vito Marcantonio Forum, we're very, very motivated to repair damage from the past. We're forward-looking, but I think our specific task in some ways is to go back and acknowledge the terrible wrongs that occurred in the United States of America in its efforts to destroy the progressive movement and to destroy the unions and the organizations that fought for the people and that provided leadership and provided continuity, and which enabled us to have great leaders like Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia and like Franklin Delano Roosevelt and like Vito Marcantonio. And we need to go back and look at that to defend ourselves from future repressions, but also to see where did the story leave off? Where did the story leave off? How could it be that we once had an American Labor Party that the mayor of LaGuardia was an enrolled member of, the Vito Marcantonio was a national spokesperson, that it was the major political party in El Barrio, the majority party in El Barrio. It's interesting. And, supporting Adam Clayton Powell and electing Benjamin Davis and Peter Caccione to the City Council, this powerful force for progress that enabled baseball to be integrated, that fought against anti-Semitism, that supported unions, and gave people a feeling of courage and hope and strength. In 1947, there were 305 headquarters of the American Labor Party in New York City. 305. We have one today. One, just one. You know, and this is not to go back and to weep or to get, no, this is not nostalgia. This is to encourage us and to see that that's been taken away from us by people whose motives are rotten and mean and rapacious and cruel and hateful. And I think that with Marcantonio, it's so extraordinary. You know, when he died right here. He fell against the fence and he died. He was on his way back to New York. His wife, Miriam, wonderful woman, and she was a wasp. And, you know, she was 5 inches taller and 11 years older. You know, whenever you see a mixed match couple, there's love and probably sex, you know? I mean, there's no other explanation for it. So, in any case, she was, and we talk about Marcantonio's mentors a lot. You know, the great Italian-American educator, Leonard Cavello, who was really his father figure. They lived side by side in side-by-side buildings on East 116th Street. And Cavello didn't have children, and Marc's father died in an accident in high school. And they met in high school, in Dewitt Clinton High School. And then, of course, Fiorello LaGuardia, who also had lost his daughter. He had 2 children by adoption from his brother. The brother died and he took the children. But he also, in a sense, brought Marcantonio into his home and into his life and mentored him to become a congressman, a great congressman, as, of course, Fiorello LaGuardia was as well. But it's a wonderful story. And, you know, I was thinking today, you could look at Marcantonio as a great American success story. You know, he comes from a family which was not supposed to produce an American success. You know, the poor Italian immigrants. His father had been born in the United States. That was very unusual in that time. And he had returned to Italy to find a wife. There were more Italian men here than there were Italian women. So he went back to find a wife who had never spoken English, really, and was very reclusive. He had a brother that was mentally ill that kept him in the home. Very few people knew he was there. And they lived in the middle of this community where Marcantonio had been born and never left. His entire life, 51 years, he lived within a 4-block radius. It's the most extraordinary story. And he was an international figure. He was an international figure. But he was his great successor when he went to public school. The principal wrote a letter of commendation. He said, Vito Marcantonio has great leadership qualities. He's destined to be a very successful businessman someday. Well, something intervened where he became something other than a businessman. Thank God for him and thank God for us. And when he became, through meeting Cavello in high school, and then through Cavello, meeting LaGuardia, he didn't become a businessman. He became a great people's leader and a great national leader for the left. And, you know, he was one of 2 Italian boys that went to high school from that elementary school, and one of them quit within 2 months and returned home. They felt so uncomfortable in the school. They felt so unable to function in that situation, in the school, which was not welcoming to them. And then coming back to the neighborhood, they had to take a lot of opposition within the neighborhood. That Marcantonio was called a professor by the other kids. Marcantonio would leave his books in a candy store on the way home from school and later go back and get the books and take them home. And he goes on not just to graduate from Dewitt Clinton High School, but to get a law degree from NYU and to start a life of service, a service to his community. The inspiration and the guidance for service came from Cavello. Cavello had a settlement house background, and there was a mentor there, a woman, Anna Ruddy, that took him in. She didn't have children. It's interesting. And she adopted him in a sense. And he went on to Columbia. And the whole orientation of the community centers, the settlement houses, was really the social gospel. It was a social gospel. Live like Jesus lived. Be of service to people. Be helpful to people. Be humble. Don't accumulate wealth. And Covello adopted that. He became Protestant, very unusual for an Italian, as we know. But then he imbibed that into Marcantonio and the other Italian boys in Newark Clinton High School that were organized into a club, the Circolo Italiano. And these kids are doing very bad in school. What he encouraged the boys to do was not just to study harder, but to go back to the community to help the kids that were doing worse. That helps people more. That's what makes people stronger. That's what makes them leaders, and that's what makes them successful. And Marcantonio took that, and he did that for the rest of his life. I think that, people say today that you go to a funeral, a memorial, and everybody's singing Kumbaya, we're celebrating, we're not sad. Nonsense. It's very sad what somebody does, especially given the circumstances. And the circumstances of Marcantonio's death were particularly horrible. He had, from starting with nothing, he had grown up in a tenement, under very, very difficult circumstances, an orphan, and to rise to the position of a congressman in the United States Congress. He was the only Italian in the United States Congress. The only Italian out of 435 congressmen. He was the only Italian American. LaGuardia had been the only Italian American before him. He had been the congressman for 10 years in East Harlem before Marc. And to become a congressman, and then within the Congress, to gain tremendous influence, while being a member of a party that had one congressman. He was able to do that. It's the most remarkable thing that he got on the floor. He probably spoke more than any other congressman in Congress at the time. He's endlessly, you just turn the pages of the congressional record. Interpellation and speech after interpellation and speech. He was cited in the New York Times during the war, especially. He was cited one year 220 times in the New York Times, including banner headlines. Banner headlines on the front page. Vito Marcantonio prevents the arms budget from going through because they would not provide money for the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which outlawed discrimination against African Americans, Puerto Ricans, Italians, and Jews. And he stopped the arms budget until the appropriation came through. Banner headlines in the New York Times, front page. My uncle once said, he was a smart uncle. All the people that are smart in my family, they're either alcoholic, mentally ill, or usually both. But he wasn't, but he was very interesting guy. And Uncle Bill said to me, Jerry, at that time, he said, the three most famous New Yorkers were LaGuardia, O'Dwyer, and Vito Marcantonio. Everyone knew him. He was everywhere, spoken about. And then, he becomes a national leader of civil rights. Something that we haven't had since is the great spokesperson for the foreign-born and the immigrants. Name me somebody in Congress that takes that role, that consistently gets on his feet to defend the foreign-born and the immigrants. Marcantonio became a national leader in that area, the great supporter for Puerto Rico and independence of Puerto Rico. You couldn't find, I don't think, somebody from another nationality adopting a cause of another nationality with more heart, with more sincerity, with more dedication. He submitted 5 bills for independence for Puerto Rico. And he said when Puerto Rico becomes independent, the United States has to indemnify the people of Puerto Rico for all of the damage that's been done to the economy, all the damage that's been done to the society by the corporations that seized all the land from the independent farmers and wrecked everything there. Great leader. The fighter for peace. The fighter against the United States imperialism, which almost destroyed the world. We had dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. We didn't even wait. 2 days later, drop another bomb. The great irony, the two great centers of Christianity in Japan, nobody ever mentions that. They were the two biggest centers of Christianity in Japan. Hiroshima, not even wait. Boom, another atom bomb. And threatening to drop more. Threatening against the Soviet Union, against China. And when people tried to do something about that, like the Rosenbergs, they were executed to prevent that. So he got on his feet to fight all of these things. The only congressman to vote against the Korean War. The only, he was extraordinary. And the speeches are so rich and so magnificently constructed and so convincing. Well, a campaign begins pretty early, but when it starts with the McCarthy era in a very, very intense way to eliminate him. I believe this. I can't prove it. If somebody could show me how I could prove it, I would really spend my fading days doing that. But I don't know how to prove it. My guess is, my belief is, that there is no political figure in Congress, at least, that was subject to more scurrilous abuse and defamation than Vito Marcantonio. The level of it, the intensity of it, the consistency of it is, I believe, unrivaled. There are 435 congressmen. And for the New York Times to spend 3 editorials in a row, the newspaper of record in the United States of America, the most prestigious newspaper in the United States of America, in the middle of an election campaign, 1948, having 3 editorials in a row saying why it's of primary importance to defeat a congressman from East Harlem, Vito Marcantonio, something of international importance to defeat the one person speaking out against what was occurring with McCarthyism at home and with the Truman Doctrine abroad. And then in the tabloid press, the amount of dirt, the amount of defamation that went on is just absolutely unbelievable. It's sickening. And yet he kept winning. They couldn't defeat him. So what did they do? They changed the election laws. Why not? Why not change the election laws? Somebody gets elected that's against the capitalist system, that's against McCarthy. What are you going to do? If you can't defame him out of existence, if you can't curse him out of existence, well, change the election laws. You can change the district, which they did, but that he still won. So what they did was an absolutely insidious move. Is in New York State we have fusion, which it can be good. It can also be worked the other way, by the way, but which allows a candidate to run on more than one political line. And as we all know, then those are tallied together. The question is, who decides who can run in primaries? And obviously, if you can run in another political party's and get the endorsement, how would you get that? Well, you would get that by going into the primaries and vying for that with other candidates. That's what existed. But Marcantonio would go into the primaries of the Democratic and Republican parties and win them. In 1942 and 1944, he won all the primaries. So what do you do in that case? Change the law. And the law was changed, and it has never been reversed, that the way that another party decides who would be to run under their banner will be decided by the district council of that party. So the bosses, the paid political bosses, now decide who can have the designation of Democrat, Republican, and so on. Well, guess what? He still won. He still won in 1948, running solely under the American Labor Party. But the attacks were becoming so incredibly strong that God knows what would have happened. But to make sure that there would be no mistake, the Democratic, Republican, and so-called liberal parties ran a candidate in fusion and defeated him. The people of East Harlem, Italians and Puerto Ricans and African Americans, over 60% voted for Marcantonio in 1950. But in any case, what occurred then was a kind of downward spiral, and he was trying to revive. And he was going to run on a separate ticket in 1954. And so he was coming back from a little country house that his wife had inherited from her brother. And he got on the train. He got off at 125th Street. He got on the subway, and he got off at City Hall Station. He was on his way not to the American Labor Party headquarters, which was on Murray Street, but to his law office on Park Place. And as he walked along, he must have come out and then cut over and walked along. He fell dead over here. Now, mercifully, a woman, of course it would be a woman, stopped and to check and see, and she saw that he was dead. And she found a policeman, and the policeman came and looked through his pockets, and they found it was the congressman, Marcantonio. Everybody knew. But they also found all kinds of Catholic amulets. They had rosary beads, he had a scapular, he had miraculous medals, for death. That's what it has to do with death, and so on. And so they called the policeman from St. Peter's Church, and the priest ran over here and gave Marcantonio the last rites. And a huge requiem mass was being organized at Our Lady of Mount Carmel on East 115th Street in East Harlem, and Cardinal Spellman decided, under his own wisdom, to refuse to allow Marcantonio to have a requiem mass and to be buried in the Catholic cemetery. So it follows this kind of, losing everything, and then even losing his right to be a Catholic, according to Cardinal Spellman, is a tragic situation. And then thereafter, to see that his name has been erased from the history of the United States, erased from the exact areas where he had fought so hard. For Puerto Rico, his name isn't there. Civil rights, civil liberties, whatever it might be, for labor legislation. Not only fought, but was incredibly successful, repeatedly extremely successful. Our job at the Vito Marcantonio Forum, which I think we're doing very well, is to reverse that. And in the process of reversing that, I think it's very healing. It's very healing for us psychologically. It's very healing for us spiritually. And in terms of knowing that we have some power to repair wrong and to make things right. And that's very encouraging to us to continue to work and do our work and to live the way we want to live. And we also see is that his ability to withstand opposition depended upon aspects of politics that are missing a lot today. The one coalition. The idea that the left could win with only white people is just preposterous. And yet we've seen a campaign recently that attempted that and failed and should have failed. What a disgrace. What a disgrace to try to win as a leftist with only white people. What kind of left is that? I spit on it. What kind of left is that? He built a left with black people, Puerto Rican people, Italian people who are supposed to be so conservative. Wow. And created a coalition that was undefeatable. And he did it through coalition, by uniting people through their common interests and winning. And also, not just winning, not talking about some huge, astounding generalities, we're going to have a revolution, oh yeah. No, exactly what's going to happen, and do it, and win it. And make and take care of people's immediate needs. Take care of people's immediate needs. While you're working on the politics, if somebody's toilet is stuffed up, or the roof is leaking, or they're going to be deported, you've got to deal with that. You can't talk about the revolution. You've got to deal with their needs. And when he did that, there was no way of defeating him. That's the history that we need to look at. If we're going to ever win, if we're going to be able to stop fascism from taking over the United States of America, we have to learn these lessons. And I think our work is doing that. And we really do encourage you to join us. I thank you very much for being here. And it's a pleasure to see everybody on this beautiful day. What better thing to do than to be here together? Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bravo, bravo. Bravo.
So, all right, our next speaker, thank you, Jerry. And again, it's a life well lived, aptly entitled Fallen Hero. And we see the whole play-by-play of him walking from here to here. And I thank you all for being part of this recollection. There's a brief eulogy that LuLu LoLo Pascale found called Vito Marcantonio, The Man and His Legacy. Adam Lapkin's eulogy, published in the People's World on August 20th, 1954. There were several eulogies like Paul Robeson's that he published in his magazine, and we've had people dramatize Paul Robeson. Here we have LuLu LoLo Pascale, lifelong resident of East Harlem, playwright, actor, international performance artist, historian, and activist. She's written and performed 8 one-person plays off-Broadway, which means a 99 or more seat theater. LuLu was a 2013 Blade of Grass Fellow and the Lower Manhattan's Cultural Council writer in residence. She's developed a lot of her plays out of her historical research, including the famous work she's done on the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. LuLu LoLo Pascale.
Thank you. I have to digress for a second because Jerry brought up the settlement house movement, and I'm not going to cry. I almost started earlier. Gail, thank you. My mother, Rose Pascale, and my father, I'm going to cry, Keith Pascale, and I'm not going to tell the story of how I saw Marc when I'm a little girl, but thank you. And it's wonderful to be here with Carmen and also Melissa for your support. And we're going to get signatures. We're going to petition to have a street corner, Vito Marcantonio Lucky Corner. Yeah. And I have the petition. Yay. We're working on it. Okay. Some of you know I've been doing a lot of research on Marcantonio for a book and a play, and I found this amazing eulogy published in the People's World, San Francisco, August 20th, 1954, by Adam Lampton. Vito Marcantonio, the man and his legacy. One of the things that I look forward to on a recent brief visit to New York was to call up Representative Vito Marcantonio and spend a little time chatting with him. For more than 6 years, I watched him almost daily from the House Press Gallery in Washington. I had seen him battle with courage and skill, sometimes almost alone, against a powerful reactionary coalition in the House. Heard his brilliant, brittle oratory, watched his superb parliamentary footwork. Often when the day's work was done, we would go out for dinner and talk about what was ahead for the next day. For here was a man completely immersed in his job, and his job was that of a people's tribune, of a genuine people's congressman. Marc had a quality of intensity about him and a streak of sadness and loneliness in spite of all his many friends. But I do not want to describe him as grim and humorless. He loved a practical joke. Occasionally, he would call me up on the phone and go through an intricate pretense that he was a Latin American diplomat, extremely anxious to see me on urgent business. Once, when riding in the House elevator, he introduced me with an elaborate flourish to Representative Howard Smith, he of the wing collar, the stiff manners, and the notorious Smith bill. Judge Smith, said Marc with an elaborate flourish, I want you to meet my good friend Adam Lampton of the Daily Worker. And then he ducked out of the elevator, leaving Judge Smith and myself to sputter and hem and haw in embarrassed speechlessness. Even as a friend who knew his moods and foibles as well as his strengths, I did not really know him until I spent a little time in his district in East Harlem. One got to know this man when one sat in the office of his political club on a Sunday afternoon and watched hundreds of the people of his district, Italian, Negro, Puerto Rican, file in to tell him of their problems and needs and to ask for his help. One got to understand his strength when you walked with him along 116th Street, running the friendly gauntlet of constituents stopping to shake his hand and say a few words. One got the feeling of how utterly he belonged in this district when one climbed to the 5th store. Gonna get jumped up. When you climbed to the 5th store, walk up tenement flat where his mother and grandmother lived, and ate there the traditional Italian dinner that was always ready to spread before Marc and his friends. This is the community of East Harlem I'm talking about. So after a long absence from the East, I had meant to see Marc to renew an old friendship when the news came that he had dropped dead on a rainy morning on a downtown street corner. When I saw him, it was when he lay in a casket in a shabby funeral parlor in the slum district from which he came and where he lived. His face was unnaturally still and waxy white, and hundreds and hundreds of working people filed past his body in endless procession to pay their last respects to a man who had fought for them and always remained faithful to them. There was no other one like him in all the years I covered Congress. No other congressman with his strength and ability and courage and roots in the people. He represented the left wing of that great coalition, which included such figures as Franklin D. Roosevelt and Fiorello H. LaGuardia and Harold Ickes. The others are gone now, and so is Marc. But as one saw the people of his district file past his body in the funeral parlor at 116th Street and 1st Avenue, one understood again his strength and his meaning as a man who came up from the people in the great upsurge of the early 30s. One saw that his strength was in the working people from whom he came. And one had confidence that in the new political upheavals and conflicts ahead, new leaders would spring up from their midst to carry out what he stood for. Thank you.
Thank you, Lulu. By the way, I'm glad I'm not reciting any of the sentences about Vito Marcantonio passing away, because whenever I do that, I get choked up. And at 2 different events, somebody had to walk up with water to me because I just my throat just lost it. The people who become more and more knowledgeable of him become very emotional viscerally about him and his passing. All right, the last part of the program is this one. Hopefully we can beat the finish line before the Parks Department gets rid of me and converts me into a pumpkin. This is a dramatization of Vito Marcantonio that I will do. When the hat goes on, I'm Vito Marcantonio, okay? Now what's interesting is that, let me just say this. You know the Martin Luther King speech where he says, you know, I have seen the promised land, I may not get to the mountaintop with you, right? And then he's assassinated a few months or a few weeks after that. You know, the Marcantonio equivalent of that, it's not a perfect analogy, is two things. There's the political assassination that happens to him in 1950 when the political parties gang up against him. And the foreign policy speech that's the equivalent of the Martin Luther King speech is his speech opposing the Korean War. I tried to, in this particular presentation, I try to find a domestic policy equivalent of that. You know, I may not get there with you, you know. So this is a grafting of 3 different speeches from 1950, and that I hope will get that point across. And as part of this presentation, Gary Barno's going to stand right next to me, okay? He's going to make a cameo appearance as a Congressman Jacob Javits, and at the end of this presentation, you're going to wonder whether the convention center was named after the right guy, okay? So just give me a moment. Mr. Chairman, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Keefe, infers that it is communism to insist, as I have been insisting, that there must be an end to Jim Crow. That you can never solve this problem by degrees, by gradualism. The Negro people have waited too long and have suffered too much under Jim Crow to wait for the success of gradualistic solutions. He implies that I am intolerant. I am intolerant. I am intolerant of anyone who would tolerate conditions of segregation and Jim Crow. I am intolerant of inequality. I am intolerant of those Jim Crow conditions, and I shall continue to do so, can do all that I can in my limited capacity to destroy them. So if that is intolerance, if it is communistic, as the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Keefe, would call it, then I say that I accept that charge and I do it with pride. I am not for 50% equality. I am not for 90% equality. Because anything less than 100% equality is not equality. There is only one kind of equality, I say to the gentleman from Wisconsin, and that is 100% full equality. Call it communism, call it what you please. But that is the only solution to this problem. You did not free the Negro if you did not give him full equality and the wherewithal with which to live. It was proposed here in this House by Thaddeus Stevens that every emancipated slave be given a 40-acre land, a 40-acre farmland, and a mule. And it would have meant breaking up the big landed feudalism of over 2,000 acres. Radical, is it not? What is this business you are perpetuating? Do you want to deal with that system gradually? Do you want to temporize with it? Mr. Chairman, this amendment prohibiting segregation in all educational institutions receiving federal aid is an important amendment. It is offered in a sincere endeavor to bring about results in a situation which is crying for results everywhere in the country. This Congress must be judged by the status of civil rights in the nation. It must be judged by its record on civil rights. As a matter of history, the character of any period of any institution must be judged by the status of civil rights. As long as oppression of the Negro continues, aided and abetted by government, then that government is retrogressive and reactionary. I am shocked, and I think the American people are shocked at the neglect, the indifference, the calloused indifference with which this Congress has been dealing with the subject. The majority of this Congress was elected on the pledge of civil rights enactment. There are no more than 110 members who come from below the Mason-Dixon line. They do not constitute a majority in this House. That is a mathematical fact. Yet, we have not been able to pass a single piece of civil rights legislation. Every time an amendment of this character is offered to the Committee on the Whole, what happens? Only last week I offered a similar amendment with respect to the desegregation of the District of Columbia. I noted what happened on that amendment. 50% of the members present remained in their seats and did not vote. The Dixiecrats, the Dixie Democrats did not remain in their seats. They voted. They voted against the amendment. They voted in accordance with the manner in which they campaigned. They campaigned against civil rights and they voted against civil rights. Yet, the minority becomes the majority in this House because the majority, which campaigned on the proposition that if elected it would enact civil rights legislation, is reneging on its campaign pledges. How do you justify it? You cannot put the states' rights argument on this one. You are taking federal funds, and when you take federal funds, you take those federal funds subject to the conditions under which the government gives you those funds. The federal government has a right to say to the recipient states or institutions how these funds are to be spent. This is supposed to be a civil rights Congress. I am calling on this Congress to say to the state or to the institution, to the recipients of these funds, look, you cannot spend this money for the purposes of segregation or discrimination in jobs or employment. You cannot answer this argument except by asserting the racist arrogance of white supremacy. That is the only basis upon which you can vote against this amendment. Honesty, morality, decency, and law. Yes, the Constitution requires that this House adopt this amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to a point of information. I just wanted to be sure we have the effects of these two amendments clear. My amendment applied to colleges and universities and the federal monies devoted to that purpose. The gentleman's amendment covered all the money in the bill.
I yielded, and that is right. The gentleman's amendment is very limited civil rights amendment. The gentleman, Mr. Javits, is very limited in his approach to civil rights, and my approach is more sweeping. My bill forbids all discrimination in any institution accepting federal aid, whereas Mr. Javits' amendment prohibits discrimination only in colleges and universities accepting federal funds. I want full civil rights. I admit the difference, and I think our records in this House will bear out that difference. Now, with my amendment, you have another chance to keep faith with the people. I know it is annoying to you when I offer these amendments. I know a lot of people are annoyed and disgusted that Marcantonio should repeatedly offer these amendments, these civil rights amendments. But I am going to keep on offering them as long as I am here, and until we win this fight, because I conscientiously believe, and it has been my guiding principle, my guiding political philosophy, that no white man is free in America as long as the Negro is subjected to discrimination and Jim Crow and segregation. There can be no freedom and no democracy in any land where men and women are deprived of equality because of the color of their skins or their national origin or their place of birth or church in which they worship. I know that this principle is a challenge to white supremacy, but white supremacy has to be challenged and it has to be beaten, otherwise our democracy can never live. It is a mere mockery, it is a sham, it is a fraud. Sure, you can wave the flag all you want, and you can red bait all you want, and you can raise the red bogey all you want. But as long as men are deprived of equality and of these God-given rights by means of Jim Crow and white supremacy, so long we will not have any genuine, real freedom, real equality, real democracy in these United States. Now is the chance to strike a blow against white supremacy by adopting my amendment. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. We are going to 17 Murray Street, which is the last office ever of the American Labor Party, as Jerry had mentioned. So it's now I guess a pub with a nice atmosphere, and we there will celebrate. We'll celebrate our gathering together to celebrate and memorialize a great man. I think LuLu may have some petitions with her where you could sign to have the street naming, and we do encourage you to join our organization and to play a part.